I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is the Delphi murders. Two young girls out for an innocent hike end up dead in a small Indiana town. The suspect has been arrested, but do investigators have the right man? Here's the story. It was an unseasonably warm February day in 2017 in the small rural town of Delphi, Indiana. It's not a place where you worry when your teenage kids decide to go on an adventure. So when Abby Williams and her best friend Libby German decided to go on a hike near the Monon High Bridge in the middle of the day, no one thought it was dangerous. But when Libby and Abby did not show up for their ride home, their families began to worry, and they began to search. Then the next day, the worst news possible. The bodies of these two girls were found, both victims of murder, their throats slashed, one girl naked and the other wearing her friend's clothes. As the investigation progressed over 5 years, there were sketches of a suspect, but it looked like two different people. There was also a grainy video of the killer. Then finally, an arrest of the accused murderer, Richard Allen. Allen says he didn't do it, and he also alleges that it was a group of Odinists who were actually responsible for this ritualistic killing. But prosecutors believe they have the evidence to convict Allen, including 61 alleged confessions. Will Abby and Libby get justice? 61 confessions. Alleged confessions, big part of the evidence in the case against Richard Allen. Confessions are direct evidence of the crime. So let's talk about one confession, and this might be the most important alleged confession made by Richard Allen. It's to Dr. Monica Walla, who is a prison psychologist. So she gets up on the stand and describes this alleged confession by Richard Allen, and it's detailed. Let's take a look. Richard Allen's alleged detailed confession about the day of the murders. Allen went to his parents' house, but did not join them for lunch. He bought a 6-pack of beer. He went to the trails. He saw the girls on the trails and followed them across the bridge, the girls, Abby and Libby. He mentioned doing something with his gun, and he thought, quote, the bullet fell out. He told the girls down the hill and crossed the creek. He wanted to sexually assault them, but didn't because he saw a van. He cut their necks, covered their bodies in branches, stayed off the trails to exit to avoid being seen. Details. This isn't just, oh, I did it. These are specific details. So it raises a question, because you want to know, is this a false confession or a true confession? And the devil may be in the details here. And that brings me to my first question. How did Richard Allen know all these details? Are they details that only the killer would know? If so, that's a pretty good test of a confession being trustworthy. If there's information in the confession that no one else knows about, other than the killer and maybe investigators. Joining us to discuss this, Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald and criminal defense attorney and host of the Defense Diaries podcast, Bob Mata, both of them in Indiana, both of them inside the courtroom covering all of this. Great to see you both. Barbara, these are details, okay? You've been covering this story a long time. What are your thoughts about the details that were revealed in this alleged confession heard by this psychologist?
Well, the one detail that was included in that confession that the state argues is something that only the killer would know is this information about this van that Richard Allen said in this confession, this one confession, that he saw a van, and that's what spooked him. He decided to abandon his plan to sexually assault these girls and instead marched them across the creek, where he killed them, covered them with branches, and then fled the area. For a while, we have been hearing, I've heard from law enforcement sources, it's been out on social media, that Brad Weber, who lived at the south end of the bridge, was coming home from work. I had always heard it as 3:30 p.m. and that he was driving on his private drive. And that was a law enforcement theory, is that Brad Weber, returning home from work, spooked whoever was out there doing whatever it was they were doing to the girls at that time. Now we're hearing that that happened at 2:30. The witness who testified today said that he knows that Brad Weber clocked out of work in Lafayette, which is about 25 or 30 minutes away, at 2:02 p.m. And according to Waze and Google Maps, he should have been getting home at 2:27 to 2:30. And that's their theory, is that that is information only the killer would know, and that that's what spooked Richard Allen into committing the murders.
And just for clarification purposes, this road, it's a private road, so it's almost like an extension of your driveway if you have this massive property?
Exactly, yes.
So there's no general traffic going there, only someone who would live there would be driving down that road, and you wouldn't necessarily expect someone to be driving there.
Right. Now, at the time, the road was not blocked off, so people could get onto that road.
Okay.
Ever since the crime happened, it is something they've put up no trespassing signs and even a chain across the driveway at times to keep people out.
All right, Bob, I want to put this up. This is Brian Harshman, Indiana State Police, testifying. Prior to reading Richard Allen's alleged confession in Dr. Waller's report, Harshman had never heard anything about a van. The only person that would have seen a van there would have been Libby, Abby, and the person that killed them. Harshman looked up the owners of the property and found that Brad Weber owned a 2000 Ford Ecoline van. According to Apple Health data, Libby's phone stopped moving at 2:32 and 39 seconds p.m. Interviewed Brad Webster and found his van would have been on the road between 2:27 and 2:30 on February 13th, 2017. That seems to line up with a timeline. What are your thoughts about this van, this fact, and the trustworthiness of this confession?
Well, that's a lot of questions, and it's interesting, and I'm going to have you hearken back to opening statements. And the defense said that I want you to be aware that in the middle of this trial, that the state is going to have to change their theory, and that is exactly what they did today. They have changed their theory. They've changed their timeline. They now have the time of death that they're approximating is at 2:32 p.m. because what they did is they lined it up with this whole concept that, look, Abby's or Libby's phone stopped moving at 2:32. We know that from her Apple Health data, and it never moved again. And now we have this van that drives onto the private drive that now we have a statement from who we think is the killer that says that he sees a van, and it's at that point that he kills the girls. They're now locked into it. So they've changed it. So Sarah Carbaugh, for instance,
I get that, but this, I mean, who else would know about the van? Who else would know about the white van?
Well, I mean, if you follow this case on social media, and everybody in that town, everyone was talking about vans. Like, everybody was talking about vans. Everybody knew that Brad Weber was a suspect early on. I mean, Brad Weber had a Sig Sauer. Now the defense is being shut down from bringing that in because of the motion in limine. But everybody that follows this case and has followed this case the whole time knows that Brad Weber was one of the initial suspects, and they took his Sig Sauer and they tested it, and it couldn't be excluded.
Is Harshman from the Indiana State Police, who said he never heard of this before, is he just oblivious to facts that everyone else knows about? I mean, is that kind of where you are on this?
I mean,
Well,
where I'm
you know,
at is we're 7 years in. Oh, sorry, Barb. Go.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that he didn't start investigating it until Richard Allen was in custody. He was not one of the original investigators on the case, and he was tasked with listening to his prison phone calls and monitoring his prison communications. And that after he heard that detail, then he went back and looked at the file and started going through reports and ultimately ended up talking to Brad Weber. But also, you know, Richard Allen had his discovery. He had received hundreds of pages from his defense team prior to these confessions happening. And so there are other ways that he could have had this information other than being the killer.
All right. Well, I would say the onus now is on the defense to demonstrate that. Let me ask you one more quick question, Bob. A lot of people might be saying and be questioning why a psychologist's conversations with someone would be coming in this case. We saw it in the Menendez trial years ago. Why, in this case, is a psychologist testifying about conversations that are usually privileged?
Yeah, in this particular situation, she had testified earlier back in July, late July, the first time that they had hearings regarding these issues. And her explanation was that there's a carve out for her, that if somebody that she's treating who is an inmate gives a inculpatory statement, that she's allowed to make those disclosures. That was her explanation for it. Whether or not that violates a Hippocratic oath up and down is an entirely different thing. But I mean, they've been allowing them in. I know initially that they had tried. That was part and parcel of one of the arguments. The defense was saying that, look, she's a state agent, that what she was doing was the equivalent to her questioning him.
Right.
You know, and then so it was very interesting when she testified with respect to the cross-examination, because it came out that she had been researching this case, that she had been following this case very heavily. She had followed many podcasts that were covering it. She was on Reddit, so she was deep into this case. She accessed
everything in this case is just a little different. Everything is different, Bob.
She also, Vinnie,
we're out of time for now. Just to hold that thought, because I don't want to miss the next subject. Because coming up next, who is Richard Allen?
Richard Allen, you child murderer! Why did you do it? Shame on you! Shame on you, Richard! You're going to prison for the rest of your life! Shame on you, Richard Allen!
Celebrity trials are like no other. You not only have the drama of what's happening inside of the courtroom, there's the drama of who these people are. Paparazzi everywhere, people just hoping to get a glimpse. It's something that we haven't seen anything quite like.
A strong showing for the case against Robert Kelly.
There's this balance between the pizzazz of celebrity and the seriousness of a trial in a courtroom, and Court TV gets to bring you all of it.
Richard Allen has been married to Kathy for 30 years. They have one daughter.
Allen was raised in Mexico, Indiana, about 40 miles from Delphi.
Mexico is a very small town, smaller than Delphi, with a population of about 1,200 people.
That's where Ricky Allen lived, over there in that yellow house, early on. I think when he first got married, they moved in there, if I remember right. Very, very nice, very respectable young man. I mean, always has been. Yeah, my name's David Yoder, and I knew Ricky his entire life. He is a very loyal dog. He's a quiet kind of, he's very polite, always has been respectful to me. He'll go out of his way to say hi, you know, just to say hello to me. Very friendly, sociable. I really can't speak highly enough about the man. I just can't believe that he did this. I don't believe it for a minute.
People who have talked to, who shopped at the CVS and dealt with Richard Allen, described him as friendly. In fact, after the murders, Libby's aunt went in there to have some pictures printed for Libby's memorial. She said Richard Allen helped her, and at the time, she thought he was helpful and kind.
Interesting look at the man who's accused of this horrific horrific murder. I mean, this is as bad as it gets, right? You randomly attack 2 innocent girls. You want to sexually assault them. Then you slit their throats in a small town in Indiana. Doesn't get much worse than that. Take a look. We have some. Here's sort of a thumbnail sketch of Richard Allen, or Ricky, as I guess his friend calls him. Currently 52 years old, 44 when the murders occurred. Charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder. He's a Delphi resident, trained pharmacy technician, worked at the Delphi CVS. My guess is everyone in town at some point probably came across him, right? I mean, you gotta go pick up a prescription or whatever. Married to Kathy Allen and has 1 adult daughter. Married for a long time, has an adult daughter. All that stuff, pretty normal. Which brings me to my next question in our investigation. And it's about the defendant himself. Who is Richard Allen? Who's this guy? Still with us, Barbara McDonald and Bob Motta. Okay, you know, this is an open-ended question. Barbara, I'll let you go first. Who is Richard Allen?
So he seems to have lived a fairly normal life in this area prior to his arrest. No known criminal history. There has been a lot of testimony about his mental health struggles with depression and anxiety. He's been suicidal, he said, for most of the time since about 2015. He was even hospitalized, according to the defense, at one point in 2019 because of his mental health. Previously, when he was being held in solitary confinement in those maximum security prisons, he definitely looked out of it when he came to court appearances. He looks a lot healthier today. He's very engaged with his defense. He looks back at his wife a lot. He winked at her the other day as one of the interrogation videos played that showed them embracing. And he takes a lot of notes.
Bob Motta, who is this guy? If someone came up and said, who is Richard Allen? I mean, how would you describe him?
I'd call him like a Midwestern guy, you know, just a guy who goes to work every day, who is married, raised a kid, seems to be a nice person. I mean, if you're extracting him out of this situation and you're looking at him from, you know, an objective point of view prior to this, you know, I'd say he's kind of an everyman. In terms of your typical Midwestern guy. In terms of his relationship with his wife, they love each other. They've loved each other for a long, long time. And the one thing that you gather as you hear the evidence come in, especially interactions between Richard and his wife, Kathy, is that they're still very much in love. You know, they're a very loving couple, and this has been a relationship that spanned decades. And, you know, there was one moment in court recently where one of his attorneys, Andrew Baldwin, I think had either had some water or some spit go down the wrong tube, and he was coughing. Now, this is after the court had concluded for the day, and Allen was standing right next to him. And, like, Andy was really having a hard time, like, kind of getting the cough. And Richard patted him on the back like 3 times, you know, and it was such a human moment and such a bizarre circumstance. It really kind of showed the humanity that I think that Richard Allen probably has had throughout the course of his life. I think most people that knew him always said he was a nice, quiet guy, you know, and like that kind of one little act, you know, I think he's like, it's been said that he's selfless. So we've got a strange dichotomy here. I mean, if he is in fact the person who did this, then it seems to belie everything that he's been coming into this. So, you know, but I guess the real question is, can you really know anybody?
Right. Yeah, but there are some defendants that come into court and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it.
Right.
I get it. We've seen that. We've covered that trial more than once here on Court TV. I want to show the clip that you referenced, Barbara, in the piece that we showed before. Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, talking about Richard Allen.
There's a report going around right now that this Mr. Allen actually processed some photos for the family at the CVS. Do you know if that's accurate?
That is accurate.
Okay, and that he didn't charge the family when they came to claim the photos?
That is correct.
And that's one of the things about this story, Barbara. We always say it's a small town. It's a small town. If you're getting your photos processed, you go to the CVS. You're going to know Richard Allen. Like, people know each other and will recognize each other. And we thought all through the years, we were talking about, could the killer be among the folks in Delphi, or was it an outsider? And prosecutors obviously saying it's a man who was living amongst you.
Absolutely. And, you know, he continued to go to work for 5 years after these murders at that CVS right in the middle of town. Didn't hide, didn't move. Law enforcement shopped in there. The families of the victims shopped in there. And nobody ever called law enforcement and said, I think it's the guy at CVS. The only tip that they ever received was from him himself saying, I was out at the bridge that day.
Right, and there was the video and there was a sketch, and there's a picture of Richard Allen with the sketch behind him. And here it is, folks. There's Richard Allen, and then over his right shoulder is a sketch of the suspect in the most notorious case ever to come out of this area. And it's just like another day. Found this on a Facebook page. Bob, we only have literally like 10 seconds here, but what are your thoughts about how all of that could influence this, that there isn't a past?
You know, sometimes people that do horrible things have no criminal history, you know, so I don't think it ultimately is going to really play into how this thing shakes out.
All right. Barbara McDonald, Bob Mata. Wow, what a story. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the Delphi murders. 2 young girls from Indiana had a day off from school, but what should have been a fun day turned into a tragedy of epic proportions. Their throats were slashed, and a killer was on the loose for half a decade. Here's the story. Teenagers Abby Williams and Libby German were best friends, living in the small rural community of Delphi, Indiana. On February 13th, 2017, the girls had a day off from school, so they decided to go on an outdoor adventure. They were dropped off near the Monon High Bridge, and while on that bridge, Libby recorded a man with her phone uttering the words, "Down the hill." Down the hill. It was down the hill where Abby and Libby would be murdered. Prosecutors say the man on the bridge is responsible, and they believe that man is Richard Allen. But Allen and his attorneys say prosecutors have it all wrong. They say Allen is innocent, and it was someone else on the bridge that day who took the lives of these 2 innocent girls. But prosecutors still believe they have direct and circumstantial evidence to prove this case. And now the families and the public wait for the answer. What is the truth, and will Abby and Libby get justice? So in this case, the direct evidence would be the alleged confessions of Richard Allen, right? That is him saying, I did it, and here's some of the details surrounding what I did and how I did it. That's the direct evidence. And you can trust it or not trust it if you believe it's a real confession or a false confession. Then you have the circumstantial evidence, those pieces of evidence that if you look at and you kind of put them together, point towards the defendant, Richard Allen. Now, the one piece of physical evidence that looms large for prosecutors in this case that they say puts Richard Allen at the scene of the girl's death is a unspent cartridge or bullet that came out of his gun. So, to attempt to prove this, they put on an expert to testify. Melissa Oberg is her name. She's a former Indiana State Police firearms examiner. And here's what she said. She demonstrated how a semi-automatic pistol cycles a cartridge, either automatically if the round has been fired or manually by someone racking the action. She examined an unspent .40 caliber Smith & Wesson Winchester cartridge, which was found at the scene of the crime. She also examined Richard Allen's Sig Sauer MP 226 .40 caliber Smith & Wesson. Okay? These are the conclusions that she came to. The cartridge at the crime scene had 3 ejector marks on the head, 3 extractor marks under the rim. There were miscellaneous marks on the primer and various particles in the rim around the primer. She compared it to a fired round from Allen's gun to the bullet found at the scene, which was not fired, and identified 3 specific places where the markings matched. She says she was confident the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson cartridge found at the crime scene had been in Richard Allen's gun. That's how they put him at the scene. Here's our next question relative to this evidence, which is, how strong is the gun evidence? I just read it to you. We need to decipher it, figure out what it means, and put some context and perspective on it to really evaluate how strong it is. With us to break it all down, firearms expert, studio armorer for more than 30 years, and author of the guidebook Prop Gun Safety for Film and TV, Dutch Merrick is with us, and criminal defense attorney, host of the Defense Diaries podcast, Bob Mata, who's inside that courtroom for this trial. Dutch, I want to begin with you. I just read a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo about all of this. It's the expertise. You're an expert. Walk us through this so we understand this process and how these markings can end up on a cartridge, an unspent cartridge versus a fired cartridge, and kind of explain it to us.
So it's important to get back to the basics of how a bullet works. A cartridge, which is all 4 elements of a round, is the bullet, which is the projectile, a primer, which lights off the gunpowder, and it's all held together by the case. And the case in this instance is made of brass. So that entire assemblage goes into the chamber. The chamber holds it snug, and when you fire it, the bullet goes out the barrel. That chamber potentially could leave marks on the case. The chamber is designed to let the bullet come in and out smoothly, but when you fire it, that case does expand a little bit, and then there's an extractor, which is like a little claw that grabs the case at the base and pulls it out of the chamber because it might be in there snugly, and then the ejector is a rod that flips it out of the extractor and tosses it away. So the process of the bullet going in the chamber, the extractor grabs it, and the ejector pushes it further out of the way. But each of those 2 things, the extractor and the ejector, can leave a mark. Those are generally made of steel, and the brass case is softer metal, and it will be marked as it's functioning in the gun.
Okay, can you demonstrate any of this for us? Just give us a better idea of how all this is working.
Yeah, so I'll switch to my overhead camera here. I have a box of studio dummies that we use for the movies. These are dummy cartridges, and they each have a rattle in them, and I'll rattle it for the microphone. You might be able to hear that. So I've tested each of these. These are dummy rounds. I'm going to chamber one into this. This is not the same pistol. I didn't have access to a P226 this quickly. So this H&K USP will function very similarly. I'll take the magazine, put it in the grip, and when I chamber around, you can see it go from the magazine into the chamber. And then when it ejects, it pulls it out of the case and shoots it out. So inside the gun, you'll see this is the extractor rod that pulls out the case, and then the ejector rod is the one that pushes it off of the extractor. And it's important to note the base of the cartridge has a little notch here so that it can be grabbed by the extractor.
So when you put it in, let me ask you a question really quickly. So when you placed it in there and then it popped out, is that considered cycling through the gun, and it's an unspent cartridge at that point?
That's correct. So you can take a full live cartridge, feed it into the chamber from the magazine, and that has been cycled into the breech. And you can manually eject it by pulling the action open, and that clears the breech. Or you can fire the gun, which is the energy of the cartridge itself that pushes the bullet forward and puts pressure on the case backwards, and it will cycle the round from the energy of a cartridge firing. So there's 2 ways to do it: manually when you're loading and unloading with your hands, or the bullet itself firing, hence the term semi-automatic firearm. When you pull the trigger, it fires and it rechambers the next round.
All right, one more follow-up, then I want to get to Bob to get the legal aspect of all of this. So what they compared apparently inside the courtroom was a fired cartridge and then an unspent one, and she said she saw similar markings between one that was fired and one that just went in and then popped out, like you demonstrated to us. Would they have the same markings? Would there be any markings that would be similar if they went through seemingly two different processes?
Well, when a gun is fired, there's a lot of pressure and energy, and that case is being beaten back and shot out very aggressively. When you're chambering a gun just with your hands, it's less energy and it's more passive. However, in both instances, they will leave some marks on the brass. I think my opinion is that when you're firing, it leaves more aggressive marks on the brass, more easily discernible. But when you're simply chambering around and that cartridge case is riding up into the extractor little tang, it is leaving a mark nonetheless.
Okay, and one more small follow-up to that. Would those marks be similar, but just different levels of depth because of the pressure, right? Like one mark would be deeper and perhaps easier to see, and the other one would be a little bit lighter, but the patterns, would you expect to be similar?
Yes, the extractor rod, due to manufacturing imperfections, those each can be individually identified per gun. So an extractor rod in this particular P226 will leave this mark, and another gun that has different wear in it and different manufacturing imperfections will leave a unique mark on that. And again, when you're firing it, it does treat the case more aggressively, and it should leave deeper marks or more readable marks. But even when you're chambering it by hand, it leaves a mark, albeit likely less depth or a little softer marks.
Dutch makes it make sense to me. Bob Motta, let me ask you the ultimate question, though. How strong is this gun evidence? We're used to ballistic evidence in murder cases.
Well, I'm thrilled that Dutch is on here because I've been dying to talk to another gun expert. So I sat in there, and I'm going to add a little X factor for you, Dutch, and I hope that you can answer the question. So when Melissa Oberg, the firearms examiner, did her testing, okay, she took 10 rounds that she used that they had in the lab there. She grabbed them out. She first tried to cycle 4, which you showed us for all of us to see what a cycling is, where she just racked the gun and ejected 4 of them. None of those 4 rounds that she did that to left significant enough marks for her to make an examination of any of those rounds. That's when she decided to resort to firing the next 6 rounds, and it was one of those that she decided to make the comparison to, and that's where she found that there was sufficient agreement. So, I mean, in my world, if the story has been we have 3 ejector marks on this particular round, which means that we know the bullet's still in there, the projectile is still in there. So that tells us that that particular round had been cycled through, as you showed us here on live TV, or, you know, that they're popping out like that. And we have a situation where she did the very testing that they're alleging must have happened, because it's still an unspent casing at the time that they find it, so obviously it was never shot. How is that? How am I supposed to make those two things make sense in terms of we've got her doing the same action, but yet it didn't leave significant enough markings for her to make a comparison, and she has to resort to firing it in order to get a mark that she could try to make a comparison with?
Yeah, how about that, Dutch?
So, yeah, absolutely. And I had the same question when I heard the testimony that there were 3 cases that she manually fed that didn't leave a mark. And so discussions that I've had with other professionals, it seems in shooting situations like that, well, first of all, how did the unfired round end up near the bodies or near the crime scene? And any manner of thing could have happened. He could have cycled an extra round at the beginning to chamber it. He could have had a jam or didn't feed, and then he aggressively cycled it. And I think the thing is if you're in a panic and you're in a very stress-induced moment, you might cycle that gun very hard to get it clear. You might do it very aggressively. And if this investigator did a gentle cycling, it's far less likely to leave a mark. So that's how I'm making a mental connection in the gap there between the unmarked cases that she tried in controlled circumstances and what happened at the crime scene.
Dutch Merrick, nobody does it better. Thank you so much. When we come back, what was revealed in the recorded calls?
No man is born evil.
So you chose bad. On the next Interview with a Killer. You created the plan.
I didn't actually shoot her.
You did murder her, though.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? Did it occur to you that you had just gone from troubled teen to teenage murderer? What was the plan?
She needed payback.
Payback with her life? Interview with a Killer. New episode Sunday, 8/7 Central. Only on Court TV.
In October of 2022, surprisingly, we got word that there was an arrest.
What? Disbelief. Like, okay, I'm hearing this, but it's a process.
Like the rest of national media, I showed up to watch that press conference to announce the arrest, not knowing what to expect.
Today is not a day to celebrate, but the arrest of Richard M. Allen of Delphi on 2 counts of murder is sure a major step in leading to the conclusion of this long-term and complex investigation.
We expected to be excited and happy and overjoyed that he's arrested, but now we're dealing with understanding that there's a lot of reopening wounds that's coming with that.
And that was really the beginning of the next chapter of this story and this case. And things have happened since the arrest of Richard Allen that are sort of different, that you don't see in a lot of cases. But there are these confessions, and some of them are recorded. Brian Harshman, Indiana State Police, take a look at this, monitored Richard Allen's communications after his arrest. 700 phone calls. He says Allen made incriminating statements and calls to his mother and his wife. He says in the calls, Richard Allen is calm, subdued, solemn. Allen's rate of speech is consistent between making confessions and talking about other matters. Didn't think Richard Allen was under duress when he made confessions during these calls. He believes that Richard Allen is the voice that we were listening to for years of the bridge guy. So that brings us to our next question in the investigation. It's all about these calls, which are recorded. What was revealed in the recorded calls? Here to discuss, Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald and Bob Mata still with us. I want to read partial transcripts from 2 of the calls. November 13th, 2022, call with Kathy Allen. That's his wife. Richard, what they want me to say, I'll say it. I can't explain what's going on. I'll say whatever they want me to say. I'll see you in another life. Then you go to April 3rd, 2023, call with Kathy Allen. Richard, I wanted to apologize. Richard, I did it. I killed Abby and Libby. Kathy, no, you didn't. Richard, yes, I did. I don't know why. Kathy, why would you say that? Richard, because maybe I did. Kathy, they are messing with your mind. Barbara McDonald, that's just a transcript. Paint the picture for us of what these things sound like and what you're hearing as they're being played.
Well, I disagreed a little bit with the witness. I didn't think that he sounded so calm and solemn in these calls. I thought many times he sounded quite emotional. He got very choked up at times. You could tell that he was crying and sometimes even sobbing as he talked with his wife. She also was very emotional in talking with him. We heard that these calls were all in the vicinity of about 30 minutes. But I believe the longest one that was played in court was about 10 minutes. And they did play the complete calls of the 7 calls they chose to play. Bradley Rosie, Richard Allen's lead defense attorney, said that all of the confessions were very generic, and they did sound very generic. Things like, I did it. I want you to know I did it. Or I killed Abby and Libby, but without providing any detail or explanation for why he might have done that.
Bob, what are you hearing as these are being played inside the courtroom?
It was surreal to kind of be sitting in there and listening to it, and we obviously had the ability to be able to hearken back to when they played the interrogation videos to really try to compare and contrast his kind of tone, tenor, speech pattern in those interviews where he was adamantly professing his innocence, where he was adamantly saying, look, I'm not going to be a fall guy in this thing. And to hear this and to kind of have the background of what was going on psychologically with him in terms of, you know, this state of psychosis that he was in and learning that he had Haldol injections. So you have that kind of background, then you're listening. And obviously, as a defense attorney, I'm trying to listen to see, can I trust it? You know, are there details in the places where we're actually hearing him speak as opposed to somebody else writing down his words that is somebody that works in that prison? You know, and I agree with Rosie. They are all very generic. I did it. In almost every statement that we heard or every call, it's one point or another during the conversation, he says that I think I'm losing my mind or I've lost my mind. You know, so it's like you can hear that he's just going through it. You know, I mean, they're like, anybody that's listening to this and is being intellectually honest and they understand the conditions of his incarceration in a prison for 13 months in solitary, and they're not taking into account that would affect him mentally, I think is just being dishonest with themselves. So, like, I'm hearing a broken man is what I'm hearing. That's the way that I feel about it.
I have some more, and I'm going to go May 10th, 2023, a call with Kathy Allen. Richard, I just think maybe I've lost my mind. I need to say something anyway. I need you to know that I did this. May 20th, again, with his wife. I need to know that you still love me, baby. I may have to spend the rest of my life in here. I might only get to see you one last time if I get the electric chair. Barbara, we have about 20 seconds or so here. Give us more of the context of the timeline of this and where he is.
The majority of these calls all happening between April and May of 2023. This was after he had already been in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison for 5 months, away from his family, wasn't allowed in-person visits, wasn't allowed to get out in daylight, wasn't allowed to go out in the yard for rec time, and at times was being treated against his will for those psychosis symptoms that he was exhibiting, according to the psychologist.
Barbara McDonald, Bob Mata, incredible insight. Thank you both so much. The evidence in this case is not overwhelming. There are problems, but if you take it at face value, there's more than enough. The timeline seems to work. The videos, they're grainy, but they can sort of match it up. The ballistics we talked about, and yes, the confessions. The question is, however, will a jury take the evidence at face value, or will they not trust it beyond a reasonable doubt? I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.